When I first started working at the Lost Airline Luggage warehouse, I thought it would be the kind of job you could do on autopilot. You know, sorting through suitcases, matching tags, and occasionally finding the weird stuff people left behind. Like that one time someone packed an entire taxidermied raccoon. But after a few months, the novelty wore off, and it became just rows and rows of unclaimed baggage waiting for someone who was never going to show up. The place is massive, like a graveyard for forgotten lives. We hold on to bags for 90 days. If no one claims them, the contents are auctioned off, and the cycle starts over. My supervisor, Dale, once joked that every suitcase holds a secret, but most of the time, it's just dirty laundry and charges for phones no one uses anymore. But then I noticed something strange. A section of the warehouse I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was tucked in the back, past the rows of unclaimed baggage. The area was marked with a faded sign that just said, "Claimed." At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured they were bags people had come to collect. But the weird thing was, they were all still there. Perfectly stacked, perfectly clean. No dust, no tags, no signs of wear. And they didn't show up on the logs. One night during inventory, I asked Dale about it. "What's the deal with the claimed bags?" I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Some things are better left alone," he muttered, then changed the subject to tomorrow's auction prep. That answer should have been enough for me to let it go, but the bags stuck in my head. Something about how pristine they looked, like they didn't belong there, or maybe belonged too much, like they'd always been there. The thing about working late in a place like this is that your mind starts to play tricks on you. The warehouse is dead quiet after hours, except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the metal shelves. It's the kind of silence that makes you jump at your own shadow. One night, I was wrapping up some inventory when I heard it. Shuffling. Something was moving in the far corner of the warehouse. My first thought was a stray animal, maybe a raccoon that snuck in somehow, or, knowing Dale, it could have been some dumb prank to spook the new guy. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. The shuffling stopped as soon as I got close to the claim section. There was nothing there, just the same neat rows of pristine bags, untouched. But when I looked closer, one of the bags was out of place. It had been moved to a different aisle. I was sure of it. I called out, "Dale, you messing with me?" No answer. I stood there for a while, listening, but all I heard was the hum of the lights and my own heartbeat. Finally, I chalked it up to me being tired and went back to my work. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about that bag. It didn't make sense. No one else had been in the warehouse that night, and the logs didn't show anything unusual. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I picked a bag at random, a sleek black duffel with no tags or identifying marks. My hands were shaking as I unzipped it, half expecting to find something gruesome, like those urban legends about body parts in lost luggage. Instead, I found my childhood. The first thing I pulled out was a tattered copy of The Hobbit, the exact same edition my dad used to read me when I was little. The corners were bent in the same way, like someone had dog-eared the pages. Then there was a faded red jacket, my mom's jacket. I hadn't seen it in years, but I recognized the frayed cuffs and the small ink stain on the pocket. And then I saw the photo. It was a picture of me as a teenager, standing in front of what looked like a campfire. But the people around me, I didn't know any of them. They were smiling, leaning in like we were all best friends, but I couldn't place a single face. What really got me, though, was the photo itself. It wasn't just old. It looked wrong. The edges were warped, like the image had been stretched too far, and the sky in the background was a sickly shade of green. I zipped the bag up and shoved it back on the shelf, my heart pounding. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate joke. Maybe someone had found my stuff online or dug through records to mess with me. But deep down, I knew better. I should have let it go. I should have zipped that bag up and walked away for good. But when you see pieces of your own life staring back at you, things you can't explain, you can't just ignore it. At least, I couldn't. The next night, I stayed late again. I told myself I was finishing inventory, but really, I couldn't stop thinking about that bag. I needed to see if what I found was still inside. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe someone was screwing with me. But when I opened it, the contents had changed. It wasn't the book or jacket anymore. This time, there was a watch. My watch. The one I'd lost 3 years ago on a camping trip. Next to it was a folded up piece of paper, and when I opened it, I nearly dropped it. It was a note, written in my handwriting. "You're almost there. Keep looking." But I didn't remember writing it. And then there was the toy plane. It was identical to one I used to have as a kid, right down to the chipped wing and the faded blue paint. It couldn't have been coincidence. It just couldn't. I zipped the bag back up, my hands shaking, and shoved it back on the shelf. For the rest of the night, I tried to act normal, but my head was spinning. What the hell was happening? Who could have put those things in there, and why? The next day, things got weirder. Dale was jumpy, more than usual. He barely looked at me when I clocked in, and at one point I caught him on the phone. He was pacing near the break room, muttering under his breath, but I swear I heard him say, "Another one's getting close." When he noticed me, he hung up fast and walked off, pretending like nothing had happened. Other people started noticing things too. A couple of the guys joked about hearing whispers when they passed the claim section. One of them, Chris, said it sounded like someone was calling his name, but he laughed it off. "This place is creepy as hell at night, man," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not going near that corner again." And then the dream started. The first one wasn't bad, just strange. I was sitting at a dinner table with a family that felt familiar, like I should have known them, but I didn't. They were laughing, talking, passing dishes around. It was warm, comfortable, but when I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I don't have a family like that. I never have. The next dream was worse. I was standing in a church wearing a tuxedo, holding someone's hand. A bride. I couldn't see her face, but I knew I was supposed to know her. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from something else, like longing or regret. When I woke up, I felt this crushing emptiness, like I'd lost something I never even had. Every night, it was something new. A birthday I'd never been to, a road trip I never took, a life that didn't belong to me, but somehow felt like it did. It was like the bag wasn't just holding objects, it was holding memories, pieces of a life that I was starting to think might have been mine, or could have been mine. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop going back. It was around midnight when I was finally alone, and I decided to investigate anything that could tell me what was going on. I only had enough access in the computers to check data on the main luggage we sorted. Dale was a stand-up guy, but not the smartest when it came to technology, so getting into his account was easy. His password was on a sticky note under the monitor. The claim section wasn't in any of the official documentation. It was like it didn't exist. The first thing I noticed was how sparse the records were. There were no flight numbers, no name of passengers, no airports of origin, just dates and vague location tags. But then I scrolled further back, and my stomach dropped. The logs listed names of people, former employees, frequent travelers, even a couple of warehouse delivery drivers. Each name was flagged as unaccounted for, missing. The timestamps in the logs didn't make sense either. They showed dates, weeks, sometimes months after these people had supposedly vanished, like the system was still tracking them even though they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in my apartment made me jump, and every shadow felt like it was creeping closer. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I cornered Dale during lunch, catching him off guard as he stood by the vending machines. "Dale, what's going on with the claimed bags?" I asked, keeping my voice low. His expression shifted instantly. It wasn't just fear. It was resignation, like he'd been waiting for this. "You've been poking around too much," he muttered, glancing nervously toward the security cameras. "Why are their names tied to the bags? People who went missing. What the hell is this place?" I demanded. Dale sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You weren't supposed to dig this deep. Look, those bags, they're not normal. They don't belong to any airline, any traveler. They belong to people who've been taken." "Taken? By who?" "Not who. What?" he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Those bags are like anchors. They're tied to something else, somewhere else. When you open one, you're inviting it in. It starts pulling pieces of you, rewriting things. The more you interact, the harder it is to stay here. Eventually, you just go." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. It sounded insane. But every strange thing I'd seen in that warehouse suddenly felt like a puzzle snapping into place. "Why didn't you warn me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I tried," he said, "but curiosity always wins. It's why they keep sending people like us to work here. People who need the job but won't be missed if something happens. Now, you're in too deep. Whatever's in those bags, it's noticed you." That night, when I walked into the warehouse for my shift, the first thing I saw was a new bag in the claim section. It wasn't there before. It was smaller than the others, almost like a carry-on. My name was printed on the tag. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. The bag was locked, but as I stood there, I heard it. A faint tapping from inside, like someone was knocking to get out. I knew I was in over my head, but by this point, the bag with my name on it was all I could think about. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like a compulsion, a pull I couldn't ignore. That night, I waited until the warehouse was empty and the cameras were angled away. My hands were shaking when I broke it open. Inside, there was no clothing or trinkets, no personal items, just a shimmering, mirror-like surface. It was unnatural, almost liquid, but solid at the same time. I leaned closer, and my reflection stared back at me. Except, it wasn't quite right. My face looked older, tired. The scar on my chin from middle school wasn't there. Before I could process it, the surface rippled, and I felt myself being pulled forward. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't move. The world around me blurred. And suddenly, I was somewhere else. The warehouse was still there, but it wasn't the same. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. The air was thick, suffocating, and everything was silent. Not the kind of silence where you could hear your own breathing, but a void, like sound didn't exist. The aisles stretched endlessly in every direction, and every bag in the claim section was there, stacked high and moving ever so slightly on their own. Then, I saw him. Another me. He stepped out from one of the aisles, and I almost screamed. He looked just like me, but older, maybe by 10, 20 years. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and gaunt. He moved like every step was painful, but there was something worse than his appearance. It was the look on his face. Desperation. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "You need to leave. Now." "What is this? Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice cracked halfway through. "I'm you," he said, his voice tinged with something close to regret. "Oh, I was. And if you don't leave, you'll become me." I didn't understand. How could I? But he kept talking, fast and frantic, like he was running out of time. "The bags aren't just lost luggage. They're markers. If you open yours, you're bound to this place, this other version of the warehouse. You'll lose everything. Your life, your memories. You'll become a part of it." I tried to speak, but then I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the aisles, moving slowly but deliberately. Their forms were vague, like smoke trying to take shape, but I could see the hints of faces, some anguished, some expressionless. They were the ones who had opened their bags, victims trapped here forever. "They'll take you if you stay," the other me said, his voice trembling. "Please, don't let them take you." I could barely breathe. The figures were getting closer, the void-like silence pressing down on me. The other me reached into his own bag, his version of my bag, and pulled out the mirror-like surface. "This is your way out," he said. "Use it. Don't look back." I hesitated, my mind racing, but then I saw the figures reach for him. His face twisted in panic as he shoved the mirror toward me. go," he screamed. I grabbed it and felt the pull again, the same sensation as before, but reversed. The distorted warehouse blurred around me, and suddenly, I was back in the real one, sprawled on the cold concrete floor next to the bag. It was zipped shut, like I'd never touched it. The silence was gone, replaced by the hum of the fluorescent lights, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stared at the bag, half expecting it to move, but it didn't. I scrambled to my feet and ran, leaving everything behind. When I went back the day after opening my bag, something felt off. I walked into the break room and my usual coffee mug, this old chipped ceramic one with my initials, wasn't on the counter. Instead, there was a sleek, brand new travel mug I'd never seen before. Someone probably just moved it, I thought. But then I opened my locker. The photos of my niece and nephew that I taped inside, gone. My spare hoodie, gone. In their place were things I didn't recognize. A set of car keys I didn't own, a pair of sunglasses I'd never seen before. They weren't just random items. They felt like placeholders, substitutes for my own life. When I asked Dale about it, he gave me this blank look, like he didn't even know who I was. "You new here or something?" he asked, scratching his head. The guy who trained me, who signed off on my first paycheck, was now acting like I was a stranger. I thought maybe he was screwing with me, but the way he looked at me, confused, almost scared, it didn't feel like a joke. The worst part was the claim section. My bag wasn't there anymore. I combed through every aisle, every shelf, but it was gone. Instead, there were new bags, ones I didn't recognize. And I swear, some of them were moving ever so slightly, like they were breathing. I couldn't stay there. The warehouse had changed, or maybe I had. Either way, I left. I didn't even bother clocking out. I just got in my car and drove, telling myself I'd never go back. For a day or two, I thought I was in the clear. I stayed in bed, ignored my phone, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But then the bag started showing up. The first time, it was in my car. I unlocked it to drive to the grocery store, and there it was, sitting on the passenger seat like it had always been there. It wasn't the same bag I'd opened in the warehouse, but it was unmistakably one of those bags, pristine, untagged, and humming faintly with that same low, static sound. I left my car in the lot and walked home. Then one appeared outside my apartment door. Same type, same unnerving hum. I didn't touch it. I stepped over it, slamming my door, and shoved a chair under the handle. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the peephole a few hours later, it was gone. But they kept coming. On my walk to the park, I saw one sitting on a bench, perfectly placed, as if waiting for me. Another was on the side of the road, half hidden in the weeds, but I knew it was meant for me. They're not just bags anymore. They're markers, warnings, reminders, and I can feel them closing in. I thought quitting would end it. I thought walking away from that damn warehouse would mean I could finally sleep, that I could leave all this behind. I was so wrong. But the bags, those claimed bags, They don't leave you alone. After I left, I moved back in with my parents for a while. The thought of being alone in an apartment made my skin crawl. Even now, I keep my blinds drawn and double-check the locks on every door, every window. Not that it helps. The paranoia is always there, like something just out of sight, waiting. The bags don't stop, or at least the feeling of them doesn't. Sometimes when the house is quiet and I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear faint tapping. It's soft, rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on the floor. It always comes from places where something could hide. A closet, under the bed, even the trunk of my car once. I'll sit up, heart pounding, and tell myself it's nothing. But I don't go looking. Not anymore. Every now and then, I dream about the warehouse. I see the rows of bags stretching into infinity, a maze I can't escape from. Sometimes I hear Dale's voice echoing through the aisles, warning me to stay away. Other times, I see myself. Not me as I am now, but a different version of me. One who stayed, one who opened all the bags, one who never left. And he just smiles, like he knows something I don't. I've tried to piece it all together, to make sense of it, but there's no explanation that satisfies. The claim section wasn't just unclaimed luggage. It was something else. A doorway maybe, a trap, or maybe just a cruel joke the universe decided to play on me. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. If you ever lose your luggage, pray it stays lost. Because if you see your name on a bag that isn't yours, don't open it. Not even once. Being a single father is sometimes like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Every step feels like it could be painful, and no matter how careful you are, you always get burned. My life hasn't been great. Far from it. A dead-end job at a local hardware store, overdue bills piling up on the counter, and more sleepless nights than I could count. But there was one bright spot in it all. My son, Danny. He was the kind of kid who would smile his way through just about everything. He deserved way more than I could hope to give him, yet he never so much as complained, even when he had all the reason to. He worked hard at school, did his chores without grumbling, and always tried to cheer me up when he saw me staring at the stack of envelopes marked past due. It was just a week before Christmas when he came home from school, his face lit up with that kind of pure joy only kids seem to have. He'd been going on about this toy for months, a limited edition figure from Mackey's Funtime Playhouse. Mackey's was a live-action show in our small town with over-the-top mascots, characters in bright, oversized costumes, and a line of toys that drove the local kids insane with obsession. The one Danny wanted, Mega Mackey Deluxe, was the crown jewel of the set. "Dad! Dad!" he said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Mrs. Higgins said I'm getting an award at school for doing so good on my tests. You remember what you said, right?" My heart sank. This was the best, worst-case scenario. To get him to do well in school, I promised to get him the toy he wanted if he did well. Lately, he'd been struggling, so it was motivation to improve. The catch is that it was the hot seasonal toy, near impossible to get, especially this late into December. But now, here he was, looking at me with those big, hopeful eyes, and I couldn't bear to let him down. "Of course, buddy," I said, feeling a hole open up in my chest. "I'll get it for you, just like I promised. You earned it." Danny turned around and ran off to tell his stuffed animals the good news. I sat there, staring at my hands, knowing I had no idea how I was going to pull this off. The toy wasn't just expensive, it was impossible to find. Every store was sold out, and resellers were charging hundreds online. I didn't even have enough in my account to cover groceries for the week, let alone some overpriced hunk of plastic. But I couldn't break my promise to Danny. He'd done everything I'd asked of him, and then some. I couldn't let him think his hard work didn't matter. And that's how I found myself parked outside the Mackey's warehouse at 3 a.m. I checked every retailer in a realistic travelable radius, and a few I knew I couldn't get to. None in stock. I'd even entered phony-sounding raffles with no luck. It wasn't like I planned it ever since I promised it to Danny. I'd driven by the warehouse dozens of times on my way to work. A massive, ugly building on the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fences and flickering floodlights. Each time I'd gone past, the security seemed lax, a single old man standing guard. I didn't even have to cut the fence. Someone else already had. Probably teenagers looking for a thrill. They must have been young, because instead of the broken fence being pushed in, it was peeled outward. Such an inefficient way of breaking in. Slipping through the gap, I crept toward the loading dock. My heart pounding so loud, I was sure it would wake the whole town up. The warehouse smelled like stale plastic and motor oil, an industrial smell that had a bitter cling to it. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I tiptoed between the towering shelves. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, each step feeling like it could set off an alarm, even though the place was clearly unguarded. Then I stumbled upon the mascot suits. They stood in a line near the back, the oversized fabric-woven heads cocked slightly to one side. Mackie the fox, Cheery the bee, and Giggles the clown. 3 life-size suits, their colors faded under the small amount of illumination the moon provided. I hurried past them, swallowing the dryness in my throat. I wasn't there to gawk at creepy costumes. I was there for Danny. I finally found the toy aisle. Rows of brightly colored boxes lined the shelves, all of them holding smiling, cartoonish mascots of Mackie's Funtime Playhouse inside. Mackie was front and center on most of the packaging. A red and orange anthropomorphic fox with a wide grin. He wore a striped vest and a crooked top hat. And on the middle shelves was a lineup of Mega Mackie Deluxes. The box was bigger than I'd expected. The figure inside was detailed, almost disturbingly so, with joints that looked like they could move independently. It came with a miniature version of Mackie's signature stage, complete with tiny props and battery-powered spotlights. The words, "The Ultimate Show Fox," were scrawled across the front in bold, glittery letters. I grabbed it and clutched it to my chest, and I turned to leave, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. The warehouse was deathly silent, save for the occasional creak of the building. As I approached the section where I'd seen the mascot earlier, I froze. One of them was gone. This meant there were still people working here, moving around stock and products. I would have to be attentive for people lurking around. Mackie and Giggles were still there, standing stiff, but Cheery was missing. Then, a faint shuffling sound, followed by the clatter of something metal hitting the floor. I ducked behind a shelf, clutching the toy to my chest so hard I could hear the box crinkle slightly. The sound grew louder, and my pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Please don't catch me. I repeated that same sentence over and over again in my head. I peeked through the gap between two boxes, and I saw movement in the dim light. My fear swelled to a boil, and I bit my lip to keep myself from making a sound. Then the figure stepped into view. It was an old man. The security guard, tired, hunched over and muttering to himself, was dragging a mop bucket across the floor. He stopped near the aisle of costumes, moving things around like he was organizing them. I slumped against the back shelf, my chest heaving as relief flooded me. It was just some guy doing his job. I stayed crouched, watching the guard shuffle down the aisle. He didn't seem in a hurry, and every scrape of the mop on the floor felt like nails on a chalkboard. I needed to get out. I was robbing the place, and the longer I stayed still, the more that fact sunk into my bones. I hugged the toy tighter and crept toward the far end of the shelf, keeping my steps light and slow. The guard mumbled something under his breath and moved to another section of the warehouse. The sound of his mop bucket squeaking on its wheels gave me enough sound to slip past unnoticed. Finally, I slipped through the gap in the fence, my legs shaking with adrenaline as I broke into a jog back to my car. The ride home felt surreal, but for the first time in a while, I wasn't consumed by the dread of bills and bad decisions. The only thing I thought of was Danny's face when he'd see the toy. After everything the kid had done for me, his hard work and his big hopeful eyes, he'd finally have something to smile about. I didn't feel proud about what I'd done, not exactly. Stealing wasn't something I thought I'd ever do, but life has a way of forcing your hand. I'd never been able to provide for Danny with much, and I'd spent too many sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he resented me for it. But this finally felt like a win. A stolen and guilty win, but a win nonetheless. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, except for the faint glow of the living room lamp I'd left on. I stepped inside, careful not to make too much noise, and placed the toy on the kitchen counter. The next morning, Danny would wake up to the best surprise of his life. I could already hear his excited laughter, imagining his face light up as he tore open the box. Smiling to myself, I headed to bed. The exhaustion hit me like a freight train, and before I knew it, I was out cold. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my body aching from the tension of the night before, but a sense of calmness settled over me. Today would be a great day. I shuffled into the kitchen, planning to finally hand Danny his present. But it wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the room, a million thoughts rushing through my head. My eyes finally landed on it. It was sitting on the dining table now, perfectly centered. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the curtains of sleep. I was tired from the previous night, so I probably didn't even remember where I'd put it. I shrugged it off and made my way to Danny's room with the toy in hand. He was already awake, sitting up in bed and rubbing his eyes. When he saw me standing in the doorway, holding the toy. His face lit up like I'd just handed him the world. "Dad!" he shouted, throwing off the covers and scrambling to his feet. Did you?" I couldn't help but laugh. "It's all yours, buddy. You earned it." He tore the box out of my hands, practically vibrating with excitement as he examined it. "Oh my gosh, it's the Mega Mackie Deluxe! This is the best day ever!" Watching him was like a balm to my soul. The way he turned the box over and over, reading every detail, the way he hugged it like it was his most prized possession. I felt like, for once, I'd done something right. "Thanks, Dad," Danny said, beaming up at me. "You're the best." I ruffled his hair, barely able to stand from the overwhelming emotion. "You're welcome, son. Just don't forget, this was because of how hard you worked. I'm proud of you." For a brief moment, the guilt melted away, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time. Happiness. Danny was happy, and that was all that mattered. After Danny got his toy, I went back to work, cycling through the motions of stocking shelves and helping customers. The guilt of having stolen something and the exhaustion that followed was a heavy combination, but I kept telling myself it was worth it for my son. By mid-afternoon, I stepped outside for a smoke break. The cold December air hit me as I leaned against the brick wall of the hardware store, taking a drag and letting the nicotine reset my mood. I took a glance around the parking lot, thinking of what I was going to make for dinner for Danny and I, when I saw it. Across the lot, near the edge of the street, stood Mackie, the fox. Memories of the warehouse rushed back to me, but I cast it aside. It was just someone in a costume, probably on their way to a kid's Christmas party. The red and orange suit looked identical to the one I'd seen in the warehouse, down to the crooked top hat. But I guess it made sense. I took another drag. My heart thudded unevenly in my chest. "Huh," I muttered to myself, blowing out a stream of smoke. Mackie really was popular, and I never really paid much attention to it prior. Even on my drive to work, I noticed billboards with Mackie and the crew posted everywhere, people wearing the merchandise and such. It was no wonder Danny was infatuated with them. After a few seconds, the person turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. I shook my head and forced a chuckle as I headed back into the store to finish my shift. When I got home that night, Danny was playing in his room with his new toy, the lights of the battery-powered spotlight flashing on and off, filtering into the hallway. It was comforting, a reminder of why I'd done what I did. The next morning, I got ready to head to work, already slowly forgetting the events that transpired over the last few days. The morning traffic crawled under a sky smeared with dull clouds. I tried to focus on the road, but everywhere I looked, there was Mackie and the crew. Billboards, huge garish signs towering over intersections. Mackie's grinning face loomed above the city with his crooked top hat. One after another, the billboards lined the streets like massive sentinels, each one more obnoxiously colourful than the last. I wondered to myself how I'd never noticed all of it. At the bus stop, posters were plastered across the glass shelters, showing Mackie and his gang, Cheery, Giggles, and a few others I did not recognise, posing with exaggerated expressions. Some kids waiting for the bus wearing Mackie-themed backpacks, their lunchboxes sporting the same gleaming smile. At a red light, I glanced over to my right out of habit. And there he was. Someone wearing that same Mackie the Fox costume. Standing on the sidewalk, no more than 10 feet away, his crooked top hat slightly tilted, his bright red and orange costume clashing against the grey of the morning. He wasn't moving or waving like a mascot at some promotion. He was just standing there, facing me, staring. I felt my grip on the steering wheel instinctively tighten. The light turned green, and I snapped my gaze forward and pressed on the gas. The car rolled forward, and for a moment, the tension in my shoulders started to ease. I risked a glance in the side mirror, and I saw Mackie, still unmoving. Every part of him stayed still, except for his head, which kept tracking my car. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning as my car sped up. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was gone. For a long time, I drove in silence, thinking about what I'd just seen. It had to be a coincidence, some person in a costume again, an overzealous fan trying to get a reaction out of people. And ordinarily, that would have eased my mind. But after what I did, I couldn't help but linger on strange theories and conspiracies. The rest of the day dragged on, but I eventually managed to push the strange encounter out of my mind. It was just some jerk messing with people and happened to pick me. That's what I kept telling myself, repeating it like a mantra to keep the unease at bay. By the time my shift ended, the winter sun had already dropped way below the horizon, casting the streets in an early darkness. The air was sharp as I walked to my car, my breath misting in front of me. The lot was mostly empty, as it usually was, just a few scattered cars under the flickers of the overhead lights. I pulled out of the lot, heading down the narrow, mostly abandoned back roads that shaved a few minutes off my drive home. The darkness pressed against the car window, the streetlights few and far between. About halfway through the drive, I saw something up ahead. Something red and orange, standing in the middle of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening as the shape came into clear focus. It was Mackie. The costume was unmistakable, but something was different. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then I realized he wasn't standing still. Mackie's limbs were twitching and spasming, jerking in sharp, jittery motions. His head twitched violently to the side, snapping back upright a moment later. His gaze wasn't fixed on me. It stared off to the side of the road. It was like watching a puppet with its strings tangled, a series of unnatural jolts that made my joints hurt. My car slowed to a crawl as I stared ahead. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. As I sat frozen, Mackie's spasms momentarily stopped. He stood perfectly still now. Then, in one horrifyingly fluid motion, he dropped to all fours and snapped his head in my direction. The blood drained from my entire body as it started moving toward me. His body contorted unnaturally as he accelerated to a gallop. I punched the gas pedal in protest, the tires screeching as the car surged forward toward the thing. My mind screamed as I gripped the wheel, eyes locked ahead. I swerved just past the thing, narrowly avoiding veering off-road. I stole a glance in the rearview mirror, and I realized Mackie was still chasing me, his form illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. I checked ahead, making sure I wasn't about to rear-end someone full speed. When I looked back again, he was gone. I scanned the mirror as frantically as I could, but the road behind me was empty. My hands trembled as I forced myself to focus, breathing hard as I sped toward the main road. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, and as I did, I leaned my head to rest against the steering wheel. My entire body was shaking, my pulse hammering behind my eyes. This was no human in a costume. Everything that I just witnessed was anything but human. And that's when I realized the security guard back at the warehouse hadn't seen me that night. He hadn't been the reason I'd felt so on edge. But Mackie and the others had. That must have been why there was a costume missing when I checked again. He'd been looking for me this entire time. It knew I stole from him. I sat there in the dim light of the gas station. No matter how much I wanted to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, I couldn't shake Mackie's twisted form out of my head. The toy kept some connection between those things and my son and I. I had to get rid of it. When I got home, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen and Danny's laughter as he played in his room. I didn't have to look to know he was playing with the toy I had stolen for him. I hesitated as I thought about what I had to do. Danny loved that toy more than anything. The joy on his face when I gave it to him had been the whole reason I did what I did. But I couldn't let him be near it for another second. What if it came for him the same way it had come for me? Still, knowing what had to be done didn't make doing it any easier. After it got late, I told him it was time to sleep. I waited until I heard his laughter fade, replaced by the steady silence as he drifted off to sleep. The house was dark as I crept toward his room. The toy was on the floor next to his bed, the faint glow of its tiny spotlight reflecting off the walls. Danny's small hand dangled off the edge of the mattress, inches away from it. I bent down, careful not to make a sound. The plastic was cool and smooth under my fingers as I picked it up. For a moment, I froze. Danny stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't make out. My grip on the toy tightened, and I fought the urge to put it back. I slipped out of his room and made my way to the kitchen, where the garbage bin sat just outside the back door. My breath fogged in the cold night air as I stepped outside, clutching the toy tightly. The bin loomed ahead of me, and I felt a strange mix of relief and dread as I approached. This was it. I was going to get rid of it, finally sever whatever connection it had to us. Just as I raised the toy and tossed it in, I froze. Mackie was standing at the edge of the yard. I couldn't see him clearly, but he was unmistakable. Shades of his signature red and orange, the cartoon proportions of a fox. His silhouette was barely illuminated by the pale light of the moon, but I could see him clearly enough. My body locked up, panic surging through me like an electric shock. He raised one arm in slow motion towards me, almost like it was beckoning me to move to him, but there was no chance in hell that I would approach that thing. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. He hadn't attacked me, hadn't chased me. Not this time. He just stood there, watching me. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing and trying not to wake Danny up. The moment replayed in my head over and over again. I hoped that by getting rid of the toy, that would satiate whatever was happening. I locked every door and window in the house and checked the perimeter from the safety of the house. Everything was clear. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I found sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of Danny running around. He was making little noises, and my heart broke. He must have been looking for what he was calling his best friend, which I had thrown away like garbage. I felt awful and got up, preparing words to try to get him through the heartbreak. But as I got closer, the noises weren't of panic, but of fun. I stepped into the kitchen area, and Danny was sat, ready for breakfast, swooshing his toy around like it was flying. Mackie. It was back. No signs of marring from sitting in the trash all night. I quickly wiped away my look of shock, knowing I'd have no way to explain it. I made breakfast quietly with my best forced smile. I sent him off to school and resigned myself to my fate, because I already knew what would happen that day. Mackie. Everywhere, leering in places that only I seemed to look. If there was doubt that he was only after me, it was wiped away after that day. But one constant had become clear. His raised arm, beckoning me, taunting me, or telling me something. That night, as I thought about everything I'd seen, I started to realize that Mackie might not have been pointing at me. Maybe he was pointing at the toy I was holding. What if he didn't want me? What if he just wanted the toy back? Without giving myself time to second guess, I snuck in Danny's room and slowly lifted the toy. I grabbed the car keys and headed out again. Mackie was nowhere to be found, but I knew where he'd be waiting for me. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, the dark roads rushing past in a haze of fear and determination. When I finally pulled into the lot, the building loomed ahead of me, its shadow stretching across the cracked asphalt. I stepped out of the car, gripping the toy so hard my knuckles ached. The warehouse was just as silent and empty as it had been that night, but now it felt menacing. Taking a deep breath, I pushed through the gap in the fence and made my way inside. This time, the cutout in the fence was turned facing in. Intrusive thoughts came in my head, thinking that this must have been how Mackie got in and out. But I pushed them away, focusing on what I was there to do. I entered the warehouse and navigated my way around the labyrinth of shelves. Mackie, Cheery, Giggles, all of them were back in their spots, standing just the same as the first time I'd seen them. I stepped forward, trembling as I stood in front of them. For a moment, nothing happened. So, I spoke up. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice shaking more than I was. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would. I just wanted to do something nice for my kid." The words tumbled out of me, clumsy and desperate. He's been doing so well, you know. I just wanted to make him happy. That's all. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I swear. I lowered the toy slowly, placing it on the cold concrete floor in front of me. I shouldn't have taken it. I know that now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My voice cracked as I backed away, my gaze locked on Mackie's empty eyes. The silence was unbearable, the stillness suffocating. I stood there for a moment longer, waiting for something to happen, but the mascots didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence alone felt like judgment. So I turned and left. I didn't get pursued by anything, and I arrived home. Danny was fast asleep in his room, his small body curled up under the covers. The sight of his empty arms made my heart ache. He'd fallen asleep holding that same toy every night since I'd given it to him. And tomorrow, he'd wake up to find it gone. I stared at him for a moment, soaking in the last of his blissful happiness before it would be ripped away. He was such a good kid. He deserved a father better than I. I'd taken his favourite thing away to protect him, but there was no way he would understand that. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining Danny waking up, searching for his toy, his bright smile fading when he realised it was gone. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, that I'd kept him safe, but it still felt like I'd failed him. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of Danny screaming. I bolted upright, my heart racing as I stumbled out of bed. Adrenaline was coursing through me, knowing I could have been wrong about the whole situation. Was he back? Thoughts of Mackie hurting my son swirled around my head. I rushed to his room, ready for anything, even the worst. Danny was sitting in the middle of his bed, surrounded by boxes. A full set of Mackie's Funtime Playhouse toys. "Dad, how did you do this?" Danny's grin stretched ear to ear, his eyes sparkling with pure joy. "You got all of them for me." I blinked, my brain struggling to catch up. The toys hadn't been here before. I knew that. I'd taken the one toy, the only one we had, and left it in the warehouse. But Danny didn't notice my confusion. He held up one of the figures fresh out of the box, Giggles the clown, and hugged it tightly. "I can't believe it. You got the whole set. You're the best, Dad." The only one that wasn't boxed was Mackie. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I hadn't done this, but the sheer happiness on his face stopped me. Instead, I managed a weak smile. "You deserve it, buddy," I said softly. Danny beamed, grabbing another figure, unboxing it, and setting up an elaborate play scene on his bed. His laughter filled the room, bright and unrestrained. I backed out of the room quietly, giving him space to enjoy his new treasures. Once the door closed, I leaned against it, exhaling a shaky breath. I'd left the one in the warehouse, apologized for stealing it, and walked away. Somehow, they ended up here, in Danny's room, as though... I shook my head, unwilling to finish the thought. It didn't matter. Danny was happy. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. My wife, Laura, has always been my rock. She's the grounded one, the person who keeps me sane when life gets messy. We've been married for 6 years, and our life together has been, for the most part, normal. Maybe even boring in the best way. Steady jobs, a little house in the suburbs, and the kind of routine you don't even think about because it just works. That's why all of this is so hard to wrap my head around. It's like I'm losing her, or maybe I'm losing something about her, if that makes any sense. It started small, little things I barely noticed at first. Like a couple of weeks ago, we were sitting on the couch watching TV, and I realized she wasn't laughing at a joke I knew she'd normally find funny. When I looked over, she was staring at the screen, but her eyes weren't focused. She was somewhere else. I nudged her, and she blinked like I'd snapped her out of a trance. She laughed it off, said she was just tired. Another time, she forgot where she put her keys. Now, I know that sounds like nothing. Who doesn't lose their keys? But Laura never does. She's meticulous, the kind of person who has a place for everything and everything in its place. She even joked about how out of character it was. "Guess I'm getting old," she said, with this weird little laugh that didn't feel like her. There have been other moments too, like how she zones out during conversations, or how she started hesitating when she speaks, like she's trying to figure out what to say. At first, I thought she might just be stressed. Work's been rough on both of us lately, and everyone has off days. But it's happening more and more, and I can't shake the feeling that something's off. I keep telling myself it's probably nothing. Couples go through phases, right? People change a little over time. But the thing is, this doesn't feel like a little change. It feels like she's slipping away. Like she's here but not here. And I don't know what to do with that. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Now, I'm not so sure. And the worst part? It's not just the little things anymore. It's bigger now, weirder. And it's starting to scare me. It happened a few nights ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. I woke up around 2 a.m. I think. You know that half-awake state where you're not totally sure what's real yet? At first, I couldn't figure out why I woke up. There wasn't any noise or anything. But then I saw her. Laura. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, completely still, facing me. It took a second for my brain to catch up, but when it did, I realized something was wrong. Her face was blank, totally expressionless. Her eyes were wide open and she wasn't blinking, just staring at me like she was waiting for something. "Laura," I mumbled, still half asleep. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer right away. Then, in this flat, monotone voice, one I've never heard from her before, she said, "I'm waiting for the real you." I honestly didn't know how to respond. My first thought was that she was sleepwalking. She's never done it before, but hey, there's a first time for everything, right? So I tried to play it off. I even laughed a little like, "Okay, creepy, what does that mean?" She didn't laugh. She didn't even move. She just kept staring at me for a few seconds, like she was deciding something. Then she stood up, turned around, and walked out of the room without saying another word. I sat there for a minute, trying to process what just happened. I wanted to follow her, but something in the way she looked at me, so cold, so unfamiliar, made my skin crawl. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a weird dream or some kind of sleepwalking thing. In the morning, I brought it up over breakfast. I tried to keep it casual, like, "Hey, do you remember getting up last night?" She just stared at me for a second, like she was trying to figure out what I was talking about. Then she smiled, this small, tight smile, and said, "Nope, must have been dreaming." That was it. No follow-up, no questions. She just went back to eating like nothing happened. I don't know, maybe she really doesn't remember, but something about the way she brushed it off felt off. Forced, maybe, like she was trying too hard to act normal. I've been trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal, that it was just a one-time weird thing. But the way she looked at me that night, the way she said that, keeps replaying in my head. I'm waiting for the real you. What the hell is that supposed to mean? A couple of nights before everything really fell apart, I caught Laura doing something strange. I woke up around midnight to use the bathroom and noticed her side of the bed was empty. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she couldn't sleep and went downstairs. But as I passed the guest room, I saw the door was cracked open and the light was on. I peeked inside, and there she was. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back to me, her phone flashlight pointed to a small notebook in her lap. Her hair was messy, like she'd been tugging at it, and she was whispering to herself. "Laura?" I said softly, trying not to startle her. She froze for a second, then turned to look at me. Her face was completely blank, like she wasn't even surprised to see me. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just snapped the notebook shut and got up, walking past me without saying a word. She didn't even bother turning off the light. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. Eventually, I picked up the notebook she'd left on the floor. It was old, one of those cheap, spiral-bound ones you pick up for a few bucks. Most of the pages were blank, but the ones she'd written on were covered in what looked like instructions. Not coherent ones, though. Things like, "Ask questions, wait until he slips, check the reflection again." It didn't make sense. I put the notebook back where I'd found it and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was writing about, it wasn't meant for me to see. Trying to let things pass didn't work. Things didn't stop. If anything, it was getting worse. A few days after she sat on the bed and said that creepy stuff about waiting for the real me, Laura started acting different. Not in huge, obvious ways, but enough that I couldn't stop noticing it. She's been asking these weird questions, stuff like, "Do you ever feel like you're not yourself?" or "What if this isn't the life you're supposed to have?" She doesn't say it in a joking way either. Her tone is serious, like she's actually expecting me to give her some deep answer. And every time, I just stammer something like, "I don't know, I guess." Because what else am I supposed to say? She's been staring at me too. A lot. It's not like she's zoning out anymore. It's deliberate. I'll catch her watching me while I'm eating dinner, scrolling through my phone, or even brushing my teeth. I asked her about it once, tried to make a joke like, "What, do I have something on my face?" She just shrugged and said, "I'm just trying to see something." See what? The worst was a couple of nights ago. I woke up again in the middle of the night and Laura wasn't in bed. My first thought was the bathroom, but when I rolled over, I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room facing the wall. I'm not proud of this, but I froze. Like every hair on my body stood up at once and my mouth went dry. It was the way she was standing, completely still, her shoulders just slightly hunched, like she was listening for something. "Laura?" I managed to finally croak out. She didn't move for a few seconds, but then she whispered, "Not yet. You're not ready." I can't even explain how that felt. My stomach dropped and my heart started pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. Eventually, she turned around, walked back to bed, and climbed in like nothing happened. She didn't even look at me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to bring it up, casually at first, just testing the waters. But the moment I mentioned her getting up at night, she snapped. She told me I was the one acting strange, always questioning her, always looking at her like she's the problem. That's when I started wondering if maybe it is me. Am I making this up? Am I just stressed out and reading too much into everything? But then I checked her phone. I know, that was scummy of me, but I couldn't stop myself. And what I found, I can't unsee it. Her history was filled with things like how to identify a doppelganger, signs of possession, and when someone isn't who they say they are. I don't even know how to process that. She's clearly convinced something's wrong with me, but now I'm wondering if it's actually the other way around. What if something's wrong with her? Oh God, I hate that I'm even thinking this. What if something's wrong with the both of us? I don't know. I just don't know anymore. And it's starting to feel like I'm not going to figure it out until it's too late. I thought it couldn't get any worse. I thought maybe it would blow over, that Laura just needed time, or maybe I needed to stop overthinking everything. I was wrong. So wrong. A few nights ago, I woke up again. This time, Laura wasn't sitting at the edge of the bed or standing in the corner. She was right beside me, holding a small mirror up to my face. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. The moonlight was catching the mirror at an angle, and it took my half-asleep brain a few seconds to realize what was happening. She was whispering something over and over. "Why won't you show yourself? Why won't you show yourself?" I froze. I don't know if you've ever felt true fear before, but it's not like in the movies. It's cold and paralyzing, and it makes you feel like you're outside your own body. "Laura," I said, my voice cracking, "what are you doing?" She didn't look at me. She just kept holding the mirror, her eyes locked to my reflection. Her whisper turned into a low mutter, then into something more desperate. I reached out and grabbed the mirror, yanking it away. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. And that's when she snapped. "You're not him," she screamed, her voice raw and trembling. "You're not the man I married." It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. Pure terror, like she was cornered by something she couldn't understand. I tried to calm her down, but she kept shaking her head, backing away from me. "He talks to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Every night in my dreams. He looks like you, but he's not you. He's trapped and he's begging me to help him. He says you're the one keeping him there." I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. None of it made sense. "Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're just having nightmares. That's all this is. Stress, lack of sleep. It's messing with your head." But she wouldn't listen. She pointed at me, her hand shaking, and said, "I can feel it. You're not him. You're not right." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make her believe me. She left the room that night, slamming the door behind her. I just sat there, staring at the mirror in my hands, trying to convince myself that this was all in her head, that there was nothing wrong with me. But then doubt started creeping in. What if she was right? What if something really was wrong with me? I spent the rest of the night searching for answers. I tore through the house, looking for anything that might explain why she was acting this way. Finally, in the attic, I found an old box of her things. Inside was a journal she kept from the early years of our relationship. I know I shouldn't have read it, but I was desperate. The first few entries were normal, sweet even. Little notes about our dates, funny moments we shared. But as I kept reading, things started to get strange. There were detailed descriptions of events I had no memory of. A trip to the beach where I apparently got sunburned so badly Laura had to cover me in aloe. A dinner party with friends where I supposedly made everyone laugh so hard they cried. I don't remember any of it. And then there was one entry that stopped me cold. Last night, I woke up and saw him standing at the foot of the bed. He looked like my husband, but something about him was wrong. When he realized I was awake, he smiled at me, but it wasn't his smile. It felt hollow, like he was pretending to be human. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to believe anymore. But the worst part, when I read that entry, it felt familiar, like I'd lived it before. But how could I? How could I forget something like that? I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I had to confront her. I thought if I just showed Laura the journal, we could finally talk this out, get everything out in the open, and figure out what the hell was happening to us. It didn't go the way I hoped. I found her in the kitchen the next morning, just sitting at the table, staring at her coffee like she didn't even see it. I put the journal down in front of her and said, "You need to explain this." She looked up at me, then down at the journal, her face pale. For a second, I thought she might deny everything. But then she flipped through the pages like she knew exactly what she was looking for. She stopped at one specific entry and slid it toward me without saying a word. I picked it up and started reading. Last night, I woke up and saw him standing at the foot of the bed. He looked like my husband, but something about him was wrong. When he realized I was awake, he smiled at me, but it wasn't his smile. It felt hollow, like he was pretending to be human. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's when I knew," Laura said, her voice trembling. "That's the night I realized you weren't you." I tried to argue, to tell her this was crazy, but she cut me off. "You don't remember, do you?" she said, tears streaming down her face. "Or maybe you do, and you just won't admit it. But I know what I saw. That wasn't you." I reached out to her, desperate to calm her down, to make her believe me. But she recoiled so fast, she knocked over a chair. "Don't touch me," she screamed, backing into the corner of the room. "I can't do this anymore. I don't know what you are, but you're not him." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I just stood there, frozen, watching as she broke down in front of me. I wanted to yell, to shake her, to make her understand that I'm still me. But am I? After a few minutes, she ran upstairs and slammed the door. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. Instead, I sat at the table, staring at the journal. The entry kept looping in my mind. He looked like my husband, but something about him was wrong. I don't know how long I sat there before I got up and went to the bathroom. I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I just needed to see myself, to prove to myself that I hadn't changed. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal. Same face, same tired eyes, same messy hair. But then I noticed it. It was small, almost imperceptible. But there it was. My smile. It didn't look right. It felt too wide, like it didn't quite belong to me. I'm still standing here, staring at it, trying to convince myself it's just in my head, that it's just stress or exhaustion or something normal. But the longer I look, the more certain I am. She's right. It's not my smile. I've always been a dog person. There's something about the way they're just there for you. No judgment, no strings attached. That makes everything a little easier to handle. After my divorce, when I moved into this house by myself, getting Max was the first thing I did. He's a mutt, mostly shepherd, maybe some retriever in there, and he's been my rock ever since. It's just the two of us out here. The house is in a pretty quiet area, not completely remote, but far enough from the city that the nights feel still, peaceful usually. There's a small yard out back with a fence, and I've got cameras set up on the front and back porch, just for peace of mind, you know. I've heard stories of coyotes in the area, and while Max is a solid 70 pounds of muscle and fur, I don't take the chances. We've got our routine down. Early morning walks before I start work, evenings watching TV while Max dozes at my feet, and late nights locking up the house and double-checking the doors before heading to bed. He's the kind of dog who sticks close to your side, always alert but never anxious, loyal as hell. This house never felt lonely with him in it. Honestly, I'd even say it's been kind of comforting. There's something grounding about having a routine, a companion who was always there, and a quiet space to call your own. But looking back, I realized that quietness, it wasn't just peaceful. It was something else. It happened on a Tuesday night, and I remember that because it was one of those nights when nothing feels unusual. I was sitting on the couch, half watching some mindless sitcom, and Max sprawled out by my feet, snoring softly. It was the kind of normal, uneventful evening that I'd come to rely on. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the back door. At first, I barely noticed it. I figured it was the wind or maybe some branches brushing against the house. I've heard stuff like that before. It's not exactly uncommon when you live in a place like this. But then it came again, louder this time. Scratch, scratch. I muted the TV and tilted my head, listening. Max didn't react, which should have been my first clue that something was off. Usually he's quick to bark at anything near the house, but he was completely out, snoring like nothing was happening. Still, the sound was hard to ignore now. Scratch, scratch, followed by what sounded like whimpering. I told myself it was probably a stray dog. We've had a few wander through the neighborhood before, and the fence usually keeps them out. But something about it made my stomach twist. Finally, I got up to check. I peeked through the blinds, and that's when I saw him. Max. He was standing outside, pawing at the door, his ears pinned back and his tail wagging nervously like he was desperate to come in. My first thought was that I must have left the door open earlier and somehow he got out. But that didn't make sense. The door was locked. I knew it was locked. And besides, Max wasn't supposed to be outside, because Max was still inside. I turned back to the living room, and there he was, lying on the rug exactly where I'd left him. He wasn't asleep anymore though. He'd lifted his head and was looking right at me, his ears twitching at the sound of the scratching. I froze, my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. I looked back at the door. The Max outside was still there, pawing and whining softly, his eyes wide and pleading, and the Max inside was staring at me, tilting his head like he was confused by my reaction. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. My first instinct was to open the door, to let the outside Max in and figure it out later. But as I reached for the lock, something stopped me. The way he moved. It was subtle, but it was wrong. His pawing was mechanical, like he was imitating the motion rather than doing it naturally. And the whimpering? It sounded off. Too even, like someone had recorded a dog whining and was playing it back on a loop. My chest tightened as I stepped back, my hand hovering over the lock. I didn't let him in. Instead, I locked the deadbolt and pulled the blind shut, trying to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was a stray, that it just looked like Max, even though I couldn't explain how it was such a perfect copy. Max, the one inside, got up and padded over to me, nuzzling my hand like he always did when I was upset. I knelt down and hugged him, burying my face in his fur, telling myself it was fine. It had to be fine. But that scratching didn't stop, and neither did the whimpering. It started at the back door, just like before. Scratch, scratch. Then it moved to the windows, first in the kitchen, then the living room. Each time I thought it was over, I'd hear it again, faint but deliberate. I checked the cameras, hoping for some kind of explanation. Nothing. No sign of the dog or anything near the house. It was like the sound wasn't even real, but I knew I was hearing it. I wasn't imagining it. Max, the one inside, wasn't acting like himself either. He stood by the back door, his ears pinned back, his body stiff. His growl was low and quiet, almost like he didn't want to make too much noise. I've never seen him like that before, not even when he heard coyotes in the distance. At one point, I tried to get him to follow me to the kitchen to check things out, but he wouldn't budge. He just stood there, rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on something I couldn't see. "Come on, Max," I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't move. His fur was standing on end, his tail tucked so far between his legs it looked like he wasn't there. Whatever he was sensing, it was enough to completely spook him. By now, I was starting to notice things about the outside dog. Subtle things, but enough to make my skin crawl. Its movements weren't quite right. Too stiff, too calculated. The way it scratched at the door wasn't frantic like you'd expect from a dog that wanted to come inside. It was methodical. And the whimpering? I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't real. I tried to ignore it. I locked all the doors, shut the blinds, and left the lights on. But ignoring it didn't help. A couple of nights later, I woke up to find Max sitting in the hallway, staring at the front door. He wasn't barking or growling. He wasn't even moving. He was just sitting there, stiff as a statue, staring at the door like it might open at any second. "Max," I whispered, but he didn't even turn his head. His ears twitched, but that was it. I wanted to tell myself he was just being protective. Maybe he'd heard something, and this was his way of keeping an eye on things. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There was something about the way he sat there, so tense, so quiet, that made my chest tighten, like he was waiting for something to come inside. I thought about checking the door, just to prove to myself that nothing was there. But every time I got close, my legs felt like lead. I couldn't bring myself to look through the peephole or pull back the blinds. I didn't want to see what was waiting. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that this was all in my head. But every time I looked at Max, his stiff body, his wide, unblinking eyes, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. And whatever it wasn't leaving. That's when things went from unsettling to completely impossible. The scratching hadn't stopped, but now it wasn't just the back door or the windows. It was everywhere. I'd hear it on the front porch, on the fenced-in patio where nothing should be able to get in, and once at my bedroom window. Let me say that again. My bedroom window, on the second floor. I don't know how it got up there. I don't even want to think about how it got up there. But when I pulled back the curtain, there it was. The same dog. The one that looked just like Max, staring in at me with those wide, pleading eyes. I slammed the curtain shut and didn't sleep that night. But the worst came a few nights later. I was sitting in the living room, trying to drown out the scratching with the TV turned up louder than usual. Max, inside Max, was curled up under the coffee table, trembling. I've never seen him like that before. His whole body was shaking, his ears pinned back, and no matter how much I called for him, he wouldn't come out. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the longer I listened, the clearer it got. It was a voice. It wasn't loud, just faint enough that I couldn't quite make out the words at first, but as it grew louder, my stomach dropped. It wasn't speaking to me. It was calling Max's name. Max. The way it said his name made my skin crawl. It wasn't like a normal person calling for a dog. The tone was off, stretched out like it was trying too hard to sound human. Max, come here, Max. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to grab Max and hide in my room, but when I looked at him, he was still trembling under the table, refusing to move. The voice kept calling. Max. I couldn't take it anymore. My chest felt tight, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stay inside, to ignore it. But I had to know. I had to see. I went to the back door and threw it open. There was nothing there. No dog, no voice, no sign of anything at all. Just the quiet, empty yard stretching out in the moonlight. I turned to go back inside, my heart still pounding. But as I stepped through the doorway, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the whole house. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, even though there hadn't been so much as a breeze all night. That's when I decided to check the cameras again. I needed proof, some kind of explanation. But what I found, I don't even know how to describe it. In the footage, I watched myself open the back door. There was nothing there, just me standing alone in the doorway, looking out into the yard. But when I replayed the clip, something changed. In the second playback, the dog was there, the one that looked like Max. It was standing at the edge of the yard, staring directly at the camera. Its eyes weren't bleeding anymore. They were dark, almost empty. I played the footage a third time, hoping to catch something I'd missed. This time, the dog wasn't at the edge of the yard anymore. It was closer. And its eyes were looking right at me. I shut the laptop and locked every door and window in the house. I didn't know what was happening. I don't know what it wants, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it's not just watching me. It's waiting. I thought I was finally starting to get a handle on it. The scratching had stopped over a couple of nights, and Max seemed to calm down a little. I even managed to sleep without the lights on for the first time in days. But that peace didn't last. It was late, around 2 a.m, when I heard it again. At first, I thought it was coming from the back door, the same faint scratching and whimpering I'd been hearing for weeks. I sat up in bed, trying to shake off the grogginess. But something was different this time. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. The whimpering echoed faintly, like it was moving through the walls, growing louder and closer with each second. My heart started racing as I reached for the lamp, fumbling to turn it on. "Max?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and grabbed the flashlight I'd started keeping on my nightstand. When I looked toward Max's bed, I froze. It was empty. His collar was lying on the floor, right in the middle of the bed where he should have been. The whimpering grew louder, almost frantic now, like it was coming from multiple places at once. Then, cutting through it, I heard something else. A voice. Not faint or distant like before, but clear and deliberate. And this time, it wasn't calling for Max. It was calling for me. "Hello?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice called my name again, dragging it out, each syllable dripping with something I can only describe as wrong. I don't know what possessed me to start searching the house, but I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed the flashlight and crept into the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Max?" I called again, even though I knew he wouldn't answer. The whimpering echoed from the kitchen, then the living room, then the stairs, bouncing around like the house itself was alive. I finally made my way to the living room, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. That's when I saw them. Max. Both of him. They were standing side by side in the middle of the room, perfectly still, staring at me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I blinked, hoping one of them would disappear. But they didn't. Two identical dogs, each one a perfect copy of the other. "Max?" I whispered, taking a shaky step forward. Neither of them moved. I shined the flashlight on them, desperate to see something, anything that would tell me which one was real. But they were exactly the same, down to the fur on their paws and the tilt of their heads. Then, one of them growled. It wasn't a normal growl though. It was low and guttural, deeper than anything a dog should be able to make. The sound rumbled through the room, vibrating in my chest. Its eyes flickered, catching the light in a way that wasn't natural. They didn't glow. They shimmered, like something beneath the surface was trying to push through. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The other Max, the real Max, I hoped, cowered, his ears flat against his head, whimpering softly. "Stay back," I choked out, pointing the flashlight at the growling one. It tilted its head, the growl fading into a sound that almost sounded like a laugh. It was low and deep, almost vibrating through the room. I felt it in my bones. The sound didn't stop. It just kept building, growling louder and louder, like it was daring me to move. I stepped back, trying to keep my distance. My legs felt like jelly, barely able to hold me up. "Max?" I whispered, but I wasn't even sure which one I was talking to. The growling Max took a step forward, its head tilting ever so slightly, almost like it was mocking me. The other Max, my Max, let out a soft, pitiful whimper, his whole body pressing into the floor like he was trying to disappear. I panicked. I ran to the nearest room, the guest bedroom, and slammed the door shut, throwing my weight against it. My hands fumbled for the lock, and when I finally clicked it into place, I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the knob. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Then, I just sat there. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, clutching the chair like it was a lifeline, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Hours maybe. The growling eventually stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Every time I thought about opening the door, I imagined what might be waiting on the other side. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning. The house was quiet. I waited a while longer, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, my legs felt like lead. The living room was empty. Max, both of them, were gone. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the evidence was there. Claw marks gouged into the walls and the furniture, deep enough to leave splinters on the floor. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to burn the house down and never look back. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was my home. Max had been my home, and now he was gone. For a few days, I tried to act like things were normal, like I could just move on. But the house was too quiet, too empty. The silence weighed on me in a way it hadn't before. So I did what any dog person would do. I adopted another dog. I couldn't live without the companionship, especially after what happened. Being alone was not an option for me. Her name's Bella, a sweet little lab mix who wouldn't hurt a fly. She's been with me for a few weeks now, and for the most part, things have been fine. She sleeps in Max's old bed, and I like to think he'd have liked her. But last night, something happened. I was sitting on the couch, Bella curled up at my feet, when I heard it. A faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the back door. I froze, my whole body going cold. Bella's ears perked up, and she let out a low, confused whine, staring at the door like she was waiting for something. I haven't checked it yet. I don't think I can. But I know one thing for sure. It's not done with me. I'm not really the adventurous type. I've always been more of a homebody, someone who's perfectly content staying in, cooking something simple, and watching reruns of shows I've already seen 100 times. My apartment isn't much to look at, but it suits me. It's a little rundown, sure, but there's a kind of charm to it. Narrow hallways, flickering overhead lights, and those thin walls where you can hear every muffled conversation or late-night TV show your neighbours are watching. I'm not exactly buddy-buddy with my neighbours, but I know them in that distant, city-living way. There's the single mom whose kid likes to stomp around, the retired couple in 3B who sit by the lobby window every morning, and the guy across the hall who blasts music way too late at night. It's predictable, even comforting in its own way. I like knowing the building isn't completely silent. My routine is pretty simple. I work from home, cook for myself, and scroll through social media when I feel like I need to pretend I'm still connected to other people. It's not the most exciting life, but it's mine, and I've never felt the need for more. The background noise of the building, the hum of activity, faint voices, footsteps in the hallway reminds me I'm not completely alone, even if I keep to myself most of the time. That's why I noticed it right away, when things started feeling off. It started a couple of nights ago. I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone like usual. I wasn't paying much attention to anything in particular, just the endless doom scrolling we all do when we're too tired to sleep, but not tired enough to do anything productive. Then, the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the power to hiccup in this old building. It's happened a dozen times before, usually during a storm or when someone's messing with the breaker panel in the basement. But this time was different. This time, the lights didn't come back on. I sat there for a second, waiting for everything to reset, but the apartment stayed dark. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. My first thought was that maybe it was just my unit, so I got up to check the breaker box. But when I looked out my window, the entire street was blacked out. The whole building was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no faint hum of TVs or music. Just this heavy, oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, that it was probably just a temporary outage like before. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. You'd think a power outage in an apartment complex would cause some kind of commotion. People talking in the halls, fumbling for flashlights, maybe complaining loudly about the inconvenience. But there was nothing. No murmurs, no doors creaking open, no footsteps. Just this oppressive, heavy silence that felt like it was pressing down on me. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, expecting to see someone poking their head out, but the entire floor was empty. That's when I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was the way the silence felt alive, like it was waiting for something. I went to the window at the end of the hall and looked out. The entire block was blacked out. Streetlights, buildings, even the distant glow of the city. Everything was gone. But here's the thing that didn't make sense. A few apartments in my building still had faint lights on. Not normal lights, more like a soft glow, almost like candlelight, but colder somehow. I decided to knock on a few doors just to see if anyone else was around. I started with my neighbor across the hall. Nothing. No sound, no shuffling, no muffled "who's there?" Just dead silence. I tried the woman's door, the single mom. Still, nothing. It was around then that the unease started creeping into panic. I went back to my apartment and grabbed my phone to text a friend. That's when I noticed I had no signal. No Wi-Fi, no data, nothing. I couldn't even get a text to send. I told myself it was just because of the power outage, but the isolation was starting to get to me. After a while, I went back to the window to check the street. And that's when I saw them. People leaving the building. At least, I think they were people. They weren't running or shouting like you'd expect during an emergency. They were moving fast, but eerily quiet. Some of them were dragging suitcases, others just clutched bags or backpacks like they'd left in a hurry. They didn't stop to talk to each other. No one even looked back at the building. I watched them disappear into the darkness, one by one, until the street was empty again. I thought about leaving too, but where would I go? The entire neighborhood was blacked out, and the idea of stepping into that darkness with no clue where I was going felt worse than staying put. I locked my door, sat on the couch, and told myself I'd just wait until morning. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that staying might have been the worst decision I could have made. The hours dragged on, and the silence in the building started to mess with my head. I don't mean the kind of quiet where you can still hear the occasional hum of the city outside, sirens in the distance, cars passing, people talking. I mean real silence, heavy, unnatural. I kept telling myself it was normal during a blackout, but it wasn't. Even in the dead of night, there's always some kind of noise. But now, nothing. It was like the entire world had just stopped. At first, I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, even though I had no signal, pacing the room, anything to keep my mind occupied. But then the noises started. It was subtle at first, faint tapping sounds, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the wall. I ignored it, thinking it was just the old building settling or the barely maintained pipes. But it didn't stop. The tapping moved, shifting from one side of the apartment to another, as if it was circling me. Then there was the creaking. It came from above, like someone was walking around the floor above mine. Except I'm on the top floor. I grabbed my flashlight and opened my door to check the hallway. It was empty, just like before. I stood there for a while, listening, but the air felt off, thicker somehow, like it was pressing in on me. I shut the door and locked it, trying to push the unease down. But the worst sound came later. I was lying on the couch, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, when I heard it. The faint sound of a child giggling. It was soft, barely there, but it made my skin crawl. It didn't make sense. There were no kids in this building, at least none that young. And it wasn't just the sound, it was the way it echoed, like it wasn't coming from the hall, but from everywhere. I grabbed my laptop. The building's security cameras still worked, even though the power was out, so I thought maybe I'd catch something on the footage. At first, everything looked normal, just empty hallways and the lobby. But the longer I watched, the more I noticed something was wrong. The movements of the people leaving earlier, they weren't smooth. They were jerky, like old film footage missing frames. And then there were the shadows. I didn't notice them at first, but in a few frames, I saw faint figures standing in the corners of the hallways, completely motionless. Their faces were blurred or obscured, like the camera couldn't quite focus on them. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a glitch, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the more certain I was that something wasn't right. And then came the knocking. It was faint, barely more than a tap, but it sent my heart racing. I froze, listening as it grew louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, every step making the air feel heavier. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see one of my neighbors, finally breaking the silence. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Except, it didn't feel empty. The shadows in the corners looked darker, longer. The air outside felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for something. I backed away from the door and locked every bolt, every chain. And then I sat down in the corner of my apartment with my flashlight clutched in my hand. I told myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. By the time daylight rolled around, I was barely holding it together. Every noise, every shadow, every second of silence felt like it was pressing down on me. I thought maybe if I saw the building in the daylight, it would snap me back to reality, make me realize this was all just in my head. With my flashlight in hand and my phone, still useless, stuffed in my pocket, I decided to explore the building. Daylight streaming through the windows made me feel a little braver, like I wasn't completely alone. I started knocking on doors again, hoping someone, anyone would answer this time. Most of the apartments were completely silent, but a few. They weren't empty, not in the way I expected. The first one I walked into was unsettling, but not in an obvious way. It looked normal at first glance. A couch, a coffee table, a stack of magazines. But then I noticed the plate of food sitting on the table, half eaten, like someone had just stepped out for a moment. The TV remote was on the couch, angled like it had fallen from someone's hand. The next apartment was worse. The faucet in the bathroom was running, and the sink was nearly overflowing. There was a mug of coffee on the kitchen counter, steam still curling up from it, but the air in the room was ice cold, like no one had been there for hours. It was like everyone had just disappeared. By the time I made it to the lobby, I was shaking. I hadn't seen a single person, not even through a window. But that wasn't the worst part. The message board. It was covered in notes, hastily written scraps of paper, some in handwriting I recognized from my neighbors. "Leave now, it's coming. Don't stay. Get out before dark." Over and over, the same desperate warnings. I stood there, staring at the notes for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Who wrote them? When? And why hadn't I noticed them before? Despite everything, I started to feel a weird sense of relief. The building itself looked fine, untouched by whatever nightmare I thought I'd been living through. The sunlight streaming through the lobby windows almost felt reassuring, like the world outside was still normal. I decided it was time to leave. Enough was enough. I grabbed my backpack from my apartment, threw in a few essentials, and headed straight for the front doors. For the first time in hours, I felt like I was making the right choice. I was getting out of here, leaving this nightmare behind. But when I pushed the doors open, the relief vanished in an instant. Instead of stepping out into the street, I found myself staring back at the wall of the lobby. I blinked, frozen in place, trying to make sense of it. I turned around, expecting to see the doors behind me, but I was back in the lobby, exactly where I'd started. I tried again, running this time, but no matter how fast I moved or how hard I pushed, I couldn't get outside. Every exit led me back to the same spot, the middle of the lobby, staring at that message board with its endless warnings. The light from the windows didn't feel reassuring anymore. It felt wrong. artificial, like it was part of the trap. And I realized I wasn't going anywhere. This building wasn't going to let me leave. I think that's when I finally lost it, when I realized there was no way out. I tried every door, every single one. The fire escape. It led me right back to the hallway, like the stairs had twisted around on themselves. The basement. I ended up standing in the same lobby I just left, staring at that damn message board. I even tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. It was like they weren't real, just painted on illusions meant to keep me trapped. And then the building started changing. The hallways stretched longer than they should have, twisting into impossible angles. The staircases looped endlessly, taking me in circles no matter how far I climbed or how fast I ran. One door opened into a room I'd never seen before, someone else's apartment, pristine and untouched, with sunlight streaming through the windows. For a second, I thought I finally found an exit, but when I stepped inside, I ended up back in my apartment, the door slamming shut behind me. The noises didn't help. They were everywhere now. The whispers started first, low, indistinct voices muttering just out of earshot. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere above or below. I couldn't tell. At one point, I heard laughter. It wasn't loud or obvious, just this faint, airy giggle that made my stomach twist. And then I saw it. I was standing at the end of the hallway, catching my breath, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall, dark, and completely still, standing at the far end of the corridor. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. But I swear, it was looking at me. I blinked, and it was gone. That's when I bolted back to my apartment. I locked the door, shoved the couch against it, and piled every piece of furniture I could find in front of it. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give out. I told myself I'd wait it out until morning, but deep down, I knew that wasn't going to help. The tapping started again, louder this time. At first, I thought it was coming from the door, but then I realized it was all around me, behind the walls, under the floorboards, above the ceiling. It surrounded me, closing in. I grabbed my flashlight and turned in circles, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, and that's when the light started flickering. For just a moment, the beam hit the wall. Faces, dozens of them, pressed against the plaster, their features distorted like they were trying to push through. Their eyes were empty, their mouths moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. The flashlight cut out, plunging the room into darkness. I backed into a corner, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and all I could think was, I'm not alone in here. The tapping escalated into pounding, shaking the walls so hard I thought they were going to cave in. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like it was tilting, pulling me downward. It wasn't just the building anymore. It felt like the whole room was alive, trying to swallow me whole. The air was freezing now, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs, even though I knew that made no sense. My ears were ringing, my hands shaking, but I needed to do something. I grabbed my laptop, hoping, praying that maybe the security cameras would show me something I could use to make sense of this nightmare. When I opened the feed, my stomach dropped. The hallways were no longer empty. They were filled with shadowy figures standing perfectly still. There had to be dozens of them, all facing my door. The camera quality wasn't great, but even through the grainy footage, I could tell there was something wrong with them. Their shapes didn't look human. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, some weird reflection or artifact. But then the figures moved. Not naturally, not like a person would. They moved frame by frame, jerky and unnatural, each step bringing them closer to the camera. The pounding on the walls stopped abruptly. I froze, staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen. My apartment was dead silent now. No whispers, no footsteps, no creaking floorboards, just the suffocating stillness that made my skin crawl. That's when I noticed the shadows on the feed. They weren't just moving, they were converging. Slowly, deliberately, they turned toward the camera as if they knew I was watching. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. I stood there, trembling, and turned toward the door. I don't know why. I think part of me hoped I'd see something normal outside. Maybe someone had come to help, or maybe I was imagining all of it. I peered through the peephole. All I saw was darkness. It wasn't just the hallway lights being out. It was wrong. The kind of darkness that doesn't feel empty, that presses against you like it's waiting to consume you. And then I felt it. A breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, clutching my flashlight, but before I could even turn it on, I heard the whisper. You stayed. Now you're one of us. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even threatening. It was calm, almost welcoming, which made it so much worse. The light flickered back on for a brief moment, and I swear, just for a second, I saw them. Faces, blurry and distorted, standing all around me, watching, waiting. And then, everything went dark again. When the power came back on, it was like nothing had happened. The light stopped flickering, the hum of the refrigerator kicked back in, and the apartment felt normal. I sat in the middle of my living room, surrounded by overturned furniture and the mess I'd made while barricading myself in. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt lighter, almost peaceful, like the building was trying to convince me that everything was fine. And for a while, I let myself believe it. Over the next few days, things settled down. I started putting my apartment back together, trying to convince myself that it had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination or a nightmare I hadn't fully woken up from. But I couldn't settle. I packed up and drove away, the roads feeling like a ghost town until I hit civilization again. People. Seeing real people made my heart skip. I checked into a motel and settled in, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. But then the little thing started. The first time I noticed it was in the mirror. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection like usual, but when I turned to grab a towel, I could have sworn my reflection stayed still for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. It was subtle, so subtle I convinced myself I imagined it. But it kept happening. Sometimes I'd hear myself muttering under my breath, only to realize I hadn't said anything. Other times, when I walked through the apartment, I felt this strange heaviness in the air, like someone was standing just behind me, watching. And then the note came. It was slipped under my door, sealed in an envelope with no return address. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake, junk mail, or a neighbor's letter delivered to the wrong place. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The handwriting was mine. It's not the building, it's you. You brought it with you. I tore through the apartment, searching for any explanation, anything that could make sense of what was happening. When I got to my suitcase, the one I'd unpacked weeks ago, I found something I didn't recognize. A key. It was old and tarnished, the kind of metal that feels unnaturally cold when you touch it. And I knew, deep in my gut, exactly what it was. The key to my old apartment. I didn't pack it. I don't know how it got there. That night, the tapping started again. Soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, like it was demanding my attention. The key sat on my nightstand, vibrating faintly. I grabbed it and threw it out the window in a panic, desperate to get it away from me. But when I turned back to my bed, the key was there again, sitting in the exact same spot. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't even think straight. I looked out the window and saw the other motel guests looking wary. They had started getting the same symptoms I had. I could tell by the way they were looking around for something that seemingly wasn't there. I didn't have a clue on how to get rid of it. But if the note was true, and I had truly brought it with me, the only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stay there anymore. It wasn't going to let me go, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went back. The drive to my old apartment complex was a blur. The key was clutched in my hand the entire time, cold and heavy, like it was pulling me back. When I got there, the building looked exactly the same. Dark, quiet, empty. The lights flickered as I stepped inside, just like they had before. The message board in the lobby was still there, covered in those desperate notes. But this time, there was a new one. It was written in my handwriting. Welcome back. The air grew colder as I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing down the empty halls. I could feel something watching me, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me with every step. When I reached my old apartment, the door was already open. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the walls. Black smudges were spreading across the plaster, twisting and branching out like veins. They pulsed faintly, as though something was alive beneath them. And then I heard it. A voice from the shadows, calm and welcoming. Welcome back. We've been waiting. I shouldn't have gone back. I know that. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't bring this to more of the population. And the building. It never really let me leave. It wasn't just the building, though. It was me. I stayed. I let them in. And now, I'll never leave again. I've been feeling kind of off lately. Work has been insane, and most days I'm too drained to do anything but go straight home and collapse in front of the TV. My routine's been the same for months. Walk out of work, zone out with my headphones, hope no one tries to talk to me, and drive home. It's not exciting, but it works. Or at least it did. A few nights ago, I decided to mix things up. Traffic was bad, the rain was coming down in sheets, and I was tired of staring at the same depressing route home. I figured I'd try a shortcut, a faster way through the maze of downtown streets. The area's a mess of half-finished renovations and old crumbling buildings, but I thought I knew it well enough to find my way. That's when I remembered the mall. I used to go there as a kid. Back then, it was huge and crowded, full of life. There was a carousel in the food court, bright neon signs everywhere, and this old candy shop my mom used to bribe me with when I threw tantrums. But as the years went by, the place started to die. Stores closed and the crowds disappeared. Last I heard, most of it was abandoned, except for a few discount shops hanging on by a thread. I was already running late, and the idea of cutting through the mall popped into my head like it was meant to be. I figured, why not? Even if it's mostly empty, it's probably faster than walking around the block in the rain. And hey, maybe I'll get a little nostalgia kick while I was at it. The entrance I found was one of those side doors, the kind that janitors or delivery workers used. It wasn't marked, just a plain metal door tucked into an alcove, but it opened without much effort. No lock chain, no rusted over handle, just a gentle push, and I was in. The hallway was dimly lit, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds. The air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a while, and there was this faint smell of mildew that hit me right away. But I shrugged it off. It's an old building. What did I expect? At first, it felt kind of cool, like I was stepping into a time capsule. The floors were that old-school white tile with black accents, scuffed and cracked in places, and the walls were covered in faded advertisements for stores that probably hadn't existed in years. There was a quiet hum in the background, fans or something maybe, but no voices, no footsteps, just stillness. Something that hit me was the silence. Not the kind of quiet you'd expect in an abandoned building. This was something heavier. The air felt dense, like the building itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, and even that felt like it was straining to break the stillness. Most of the stores were exactly what I expected. Boarded up or empty shelves, their faded signage barely clinging to the walls. A few windows still had displays, but they were like time capsules. Mannequins in dated outfits, old movie posters advertising long-forgotten blockbusters, and sale banners with slogans that felt weirdly optimistic for a place like this. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was just the vibe of an old, abandoned mall. That's what happens when a place gets left behind. It felt like a ghost of what it used to be. But that was normal, right? Still, I picked up my pace, hoping to get to the other side quickly. I just wanted to be out in the fresh air again. That's when I noticed something strange. The layout didn't feel right. I mean, it had been years since I'd been there, so I figured my memory might be a little off. But the hallways seemed wrong, longer than they should have been. The way they twisted and turned didn't make sense, like the angles were slightly off. I'd walk for what felt like minutes, only to turn a corner and find myself back at the same stretch of empty storefronts. Then I reached the food court, or at least what was left of it. It was completely empty, save for one table sitting dead center. Just one. There was a single chair pulled out slightly, like someone had been sitting there and left in a hurry. On the table was a styrofoam cup, and I swear I could see steam rising from it. That's when I felt it, that first real twinge of fear. You know that cold rush you get when your body senses something is off before your brain catches up? I stood there for a long moment, staring at that cup, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was an old trickle of heat from a vent, or maybe someone was here, just a maintenance worker or any person cutting through like me. I even called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Nothing. I should have turned back then. I should have taken my chances in the rain, but I convinced myself it was fine. Just an empty building. People leave weird things behind all the time, right? So I kept going. I turned the corner where the exit should have been, and it wasn't there. No double glass doors, no faded "thank you for shopping" sign. Just another hallway stretching deeper into the mall. That's when it hit me. I wasn't getting out of here anytime soon. I can't even tell you when it went from a little weird to full-blown terrifying, but it happened fast. The hallways started to feel uncanny, like, I know how ridiculous this sounds, but they weren't just hallways anymore. They stretched longer than they should have, and every time I thought I recognized the turn, it either led somewhere completely new or looped me right back to where I started. I tried to stay calm. Old buildings are confusing, right? But the more I walked, the more it felt like the place was shifting around me. Then I started noticing the details. The mannequins in the storefronts, I swear they weren't in the same positions when I looked back. I told myself I was imagining it, but I'm not that imaginative. One minute they'd be posed normally, like you'd expect, arms out, wearing clothes from decades ago, and the next, one would have its head tilted toward me, or its hand would be raised like it was pointing. And the walls. God, the walls. Some of the advertisements looked normal from a distance, but when I got closer, the faces on them were all wrong. They were blurry, almost smudged, like someone had rubbed out the features, but I could still make out just enough to know they were faces. And the worst part? I thought I recognized one of them. It looked a little like me, distorted, warped. I pulled my phone out, hoping I could get my bearings with GPS, or at least check the time, but that was useless too. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just a spinning loading wheel that wouldn't go away. And the time? It was all over the place. 1 second it said 4:47 p.m, the next it jumped to 11:13, then it reset entirely, flashing with zeros like it just turned on for the first time. I tried retracing my steps, backtracking the way I came, but nothing lined up. The food court, gone. The hallway with a styrofoam cup. Now it led to a dead end with a boarded up storefront I was sure I hadn't seen before. I kept walking though, because what else could I do? But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. Some of the hallways were so long, my phone flashlight couldn't reach the end. The beam just disappeared into the darkness, like the mall was swallowing the light. The whispers started soon after that. Faint at first, like someone just out of earshot, but they were definitely there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, just this low murmur, almost like the hum of the fluorescent lights, but alive. Every now and then, I'd hear a word or two. I think I'd heard my name once, but I might have imagined it. I hope I imagined it. And then the footsteps. God, the footsteps. I thought I was alone in there, knew I was alone, but suddenly I could hear them. Just a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap behind me. I thought it was an echo of my own steps, so I stopped walking. They didn't. I whipped around, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just empty space. The sound stopped too, like whoever or whatever was making it knew I was listening. I waited, holding my breath, and after a minute, I turned back around. The second I started walking again, the footsteps started up too. This time they were faster, louder, like something was closing the distance between us. I didn't look back again. I just started running. I don't think I've ever felt as relieved as I did when I saw that exit sign. After what felt like hours of wandering, corridors stretching endlessly, mannequins shifting when I wasn't looking, whispers that I couldn't place, I thought I was done for. But then, there it was. The bright red glow of an exit sign above a heavy steel door at the end of the hallway. It stood out like a lifeline in all that darkness, a promise that I wasn't trapped after all. I don't remember how fast I moved. 1 second I was standing there, staring, and the next I was sprinting toward it, the sound of my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the empty space. My heart was hammering, but it wasn't from fear this time. It was relief. I was getting out. The door was heavy, but it opened without much effort. The moment it swung open, I felt a rush of fresh air hit my face. It smelled like rain, clean and normal. I stepped outside and found myself on a street, one I didn't recognize, but looked like any other part of the city. I saw cars, headlights slicing through the twilight, people walking along the sidewalks, some carrying umbrellas or shopping bags. It was just life. Real, tangible, normal life. I actually laughed. I know that sounds crazy, but I did. I laughed out loud, this shaky, almost delirious laugh. All the fear, all the weirdness in that mall. I'd let it get to me, and now here I was, standing in the middle of a busy street like nothing had happened. I even muttered to myself, "You really need to get a grip." But then I noticed something. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I was too busy calming down, trying to process everything. But as I watched the people in the street, I realized they weren't moving right. There was this stiffness to them, like their bodies were following a script but didn't quite know how to stick to it. One woman in a red coat walked past me, her arms swinging in a loop, the same exact motion over and over. A man across the street adjusted his hat, then did it again and again, as if stuck in a glitch. And the cars? They were completely silent. No engines, no honking, nothing but the faint hum of the city, like a white noise machine trying to imitate what it thought a street should sound like. I felt my stomach drop, my relief evaporated, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. Slowly, I turned around, hoping, praying to see something normal behind me. But what I saw was worse. The mall was still there. It wasn't the same door I'd come out of though. This one was different. Taller, darker, with warped glass that seemed to shimmer in the light. It was like the building had followed me, refusing to let me go. The laughter I'd felt earlier, it was gone. All I could think was, I didn't escape. I never left. I don't know why I went back inside. Maybe it was panic, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was because the mall wouldn't let me leave, no matter what I did. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was colder, sharper. My breath fogged up, and the faint smell of mildew hit me like a punch. The layout was different again. The hallways were narrower, the walls closer, and I swear I could feel them pressing in like they were alive and watching me. Every step I took made the floor creak under my weight, like the building was groaning, unhappy I was back. The mannequins were worse now. They were everywhere, lining the windows, slumped in the corners. Their heads were gone, just smooth necks bent at odd angles, as if they were staring even though they had no eyes. Some of them still had their hands outstretched, frozen in strange, almost pleading gestures. I tried not to look at them, but I couldn't help it. Every time I glanced away, I could have sworn they'd moved closer. They weren't whispers anymore. The soft murmurs had deepened into something guttural and low, almost like growling, but still just quiet enough to make me question if I was really hearing it. It sounded like a crowd, all speaking at once in a language I didn't understand. The echoes bounced off the walls, filling the air with this constant, oppressive noise that made it impossible to think straight. Then I noticed the signs. Storefronts that had once been empty now had glowing signs, but they weren't advertising anything normal. Some just had my name in bold, flickering letters. Others had phrases that made my stomach churn like, "We've been waiting for you." One sign simply read, "Don't run." I didn't know what to do. I kept walking, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain screamed at me to get out. But there was no getting out. I rounded a corner and froze. It was the food court again. At least, I think it was. The same peeling tiles, the same dim lighting. But now the table with a styrofoam cup wasn't off to the side. It was in the dead center of the room, like it had been waiting for me. The steam was still there, curling up from the liquid inside, but now the chair was pulled out and facing me. Sitting in the chair was a mannequin. It wasn't like the others. Its plastic skin was cracked, and its hand, smooth, artificial, and horribly human, was wrapped around the cup. Its head was tilted, almost like it was looking right at me, even though it didn't have a face. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but eventually my legs gave out. I slid to the floor, pressing my back against the wall as my chest heaved with shallow breaths. That's when I felt it. The wall behind me. It wasn't solid. It was soft, warm, and it was moving, pulsing, like I was leaning against something alive. I shot up so fast I nearly fell over. My hands flew to the wall, touching it like I needed proof that it wasn't what I thought it was. But it was. It was pulsing beneath my fingers, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I panicked. I completely lost it. I don't even remember making the decision to run, but suddenly my legs were moving, carrying me blindly through the endless corridors. I wasn't trying to think anymore. I couldn't. The walls pulsed. The whispers chased me, and the lights flickered in stuttering, seizure-inducing bursts. The shadows on the walls weren't staying still anymore. They twisted and moved, stretching into shapes that didn't make sense. I screamed for help. I don't know who I thought would hear me, but I screamed until my throat felt raw. The sound barely seemed to carry. It just fell flat, like the air was swallowing it. I turned corners without thinking, sprinting past storefronts that all looked the same. The lights above me flickered so violently I could barely see, but up ahead there was something else. An exit. A glowing green sign above a heavy steel door. It was different from the others. No warped glass, no sense of wrongness about it. It looked real. It felt real. But so had the last exit. I hesitated, torn between staying where I was and taking my chances with the door. That's when I heard it behind me. The shuffle of footsteps, low murmurs just on the edge of hearing. Something was coming, and it was getting closer. I didn't think. I just ran for the door and threw it open. For a second, I thought I'd made it. I felt the rush of air, the promise of open space. But then I looked around. I was back in the food court. At first, it seemed empty again, just like before, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I wasn't alone. The tables were full. Dozens of people, or what looked like people, were sitting perfectly still, facing each other. No one spoke, no one moved, and none of them had faces. Their heads were smooth and blank, featureless ovals of flesh-coloured nothingness. They all sat stiffly, their hands resting neatly on the tables. My eyes darted to the centre of the room, and there it was again. The table with the styrofoam cup, the steam still curling lazily into the air. The mannequin was gone. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The figures didn't react at first, but then, one by one, they began to turn. Slowly, methodically, they all turned to face me in unison. I stumbled backwards, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell. My back hit the wall, and I realized there was nowhere to go. The figures just kept staring, or whatever the faceless equivalent of staring was. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but eventually I heard it again. The whispers. Only this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the figures. Dozens of them, all speaking at once in overlapping, distorted murmurs, like they were trying to form words but couldn't. And then, one of them stood up. I couldn't move. The figures rose from their seats one by one, their movements stiff and unnatural, like someone was pulling them up with invisible strings. They didn't speak, just that horrible, overlapping whispering sound coming from all of them. It filled the air, pressing down on me until I thought my chest might cave in. They surrounded me slowly, forming a tight circle, their faceless heads tilted as if studying me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped. One of them stepped closer, its movements jerky but deliberate. It reached out, and I wanted to scream, to shove it away, to do something. But I couldn't. Its hand was cold when it touched my face, like metal left out in the winter. The moment its fingers brushed my skin, a jolt shot through me. Everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't standing anymore. I was sitting at a table. The table. The one in the center of the food court. A styrofoam cup of steaming liquid was in front of me, just like it had been before. For a moment, I thought I imagined everything. Maybe I'd passed out. Maybe it was all some kind of nightmare brought on by stress or dehydration. I looked down, ready to grab the cup and shake myself back to reality. But the hands resting on the table weren't mine. They were smooth, plastic, and joined at the knuckles like mannequins. I tried to move them, and they obeyed, but it didn't feel right, like there was a disconnect between the command and the action. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked around the food court. The figures were back at their tables, sitting still and silent, just like before. None of them moved, but I could feel their attention on me. My mind raced, trying to understand, to process what had happened, but all I could feel was the crushing weight of realization. I was one of them now. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at my hands and the cup in front of me. Time doesn't seem to work the same way here. I don't even know if I'm alive in the way I was before. But I can still think, I can still feel, and I can still remember what I was. I'm a biologist. For the past 4 months, I've been part of an international research team stationed in one of the most isolated parts of the Arctic. The mission was simple enough. Study ancient ice layers to reconstruct historical climate patterns. Important work, sure, but not the kind of thing you expect to haunt you. Our team had 10 people. Geologists, glaciologists, biologists like me, and technicians to keep everything running. We were equipped with state-of-the-art drilling rigs, spectrometers, and thermal imaging systems. The station itself was a prefab structure perched on miles of endless white tundra. Outside, the air could freeze your skin in seconds, and the wind howled like it wanted to tear the building apart. Inside, it was the constant noise, the hum of the machinery, the chatter of comms, and, when the ice shifted beneath us, a low, resonant groaning that rattled through the floors. Despite all the tech, the work wasn't glamorous. My job was to analyze any organic material we pulled from the ice cores, ancient pollen, microbial remnants, that sort of thing. Most days were just cataloging and running samples under the microscope while the rest of the team drilled. The monotony of it all weighed on us. Sleep was broken into short shifts, and the lack of sunlight messed with our circadian rhythms. People started snapping at each other over little things, whose turn it was to cook, why someone didn't clean up their workstation. It was subtle at first, but you could feel the tension simmering. One of the geologists, Dr. Harris, was particularly on edge. He kept saying the ice felt wrong. He'd run his hand along the drill cores, muttering about how dense it was or how it didn't fracture the way it should. Most of us brushed it off as stress. After all, you don't get to pick who you're stuck with on these expeditions, and Harris was the type to find something to complain about. But then, a few days ago, something changed. We'd been drilling deeper than we ever had before, almost 2 kilometers into the ice sheet. The core samples from that depth were pristine, layered with tiny air bubbles trapped for tens of thousands of years. It was a gold mine for climate data. And then, the drill hit something. I remember the way everyone froze when the rig operator called it out. At that depth, there shouldn't have been anything but ice, but the drill head had stopped cold. The team pulled the core up cautiously, and when we saw what was embedded in it, even Harris went quiet. It was a massive block of ice, denser than anything we'd encountered. Inside was something dark, a shape just barely visible. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but it was large, much larger than any organic material we'd expected. My first thought was that we'd hit a tree, maybe a fragment of ancient forest preserved in the ice. Harris, though, was pale as a sheet. "This doesn't belong here," he said. "We shouldn't dig it out." Of course, we didn't listen. Curiosity outweighs common sense in our field more often than not. That's why we were out here in the first place. We extracted the ice block with surgical precision, using the station's gantry crane to lift it from the drill site and transport it to the lab. The thing was massive, roughly the size of a sunken trunk, and impossibly dense. Harris argued against bringing it inside, but the rest of us were too intrigued. This was a once-in-a-lifetime find. Something buried beneath 2 kilometers of ice shouldn't exist, let alone pulse faintly in the cold. In the lab, we used controlled thermal plates to slowly melt the outer layers of ice, keeping the temperature just above freezing to preserve whatever was inside. The work took hours, and we all rotated shifts, logging every detail meticulously. When the ice thinned enough to see through, the shape became clearer. A heart. I can't describe the unease that hit me when I first realized what I was looking at. It wasn't a human heart. It was too large, about the size of a basketball, and the surface was rough and blackened like charred wood. But it was unmistakably organic, with thick, vein-like structures webbing across its surface. And the strangest part? It was beating. Slowly, faintly, but undeniably alive. Dr. Walker was the first to speak. "What the hell are we looking at?" No one answered. Harris muttered under his breath and left the room. The rest of us hovered around the observation table, staring in stunned silence as the heart pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythms. We ran every test you could think of. Thermal imaging showed no heat signature. It was as cold as the ice it had been trapped in. Scans with a spectrometer revealed no identifiable cellular structure, nothing remotely resembling DNA. It didn't even register as organic matter by conventional standards. And yet, the rhythmic contradictions continued, steady and unyielding, like a clock ticking down to something. Walker wanted to escalate. "This could redefine biology," she said, pacing the room. "We're looking at something older than humanity itself, maybe older than life as we know it." Harris, on the other hand, was livid. He stormed back into the lab at one point, slamming his hand on the table. "You're not listening," he shouted. "This isn't a discovery. It's a warning. We shouldn't be poking at it." No one took him seriously, myself included. I told myself he was cracking under the pressure. 4 months of isolation can mess with anyone's head. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. That night, after the others had gone to bed, I stayed behind in the lab, staring at the thing in its containment chamber. The heartbeat was faint, but it had a strange resonance to it, almost like it was echoing through the room. I thought I was imagining it, but when I left to get some air in the main corridor, I could still hear it, faint and rhythmic, like it was coming from the walls. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The steady, unrelenting thud of something ancient and alive. Something that shouldn't exist. The next step was to transfer the heart into a custom containment chamber. The lab had an isolation tank we usually used for volatile samples, complete with temperature controls, reinforced glass, and a HEPA filtration system. It wasn't designed for something alive, or whatever this thing was, but it would have to do. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. It didn't have eyes, thank God, but every time I glanced at it, the beat seemed intentional, like it was aware of us. That's impossible, of course, just my mind playing tricks. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. We ran every test imaginable. Harris protested, but Walker overruled him. Samples were taken and analysed, thin slices of tissue, microfluidic tests, even a spectroscopic scan to identify its chemical makeup. The results made no sense. One sample showed isotropic signatures consistent with ancient biological material, something preserved for millions of years. Another indicated it was practically new, no more than a few weeks old. Harris refused to even look at the results. "You're asking the wrong questions," he muttered, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You're trying to explain something that doesn't belong here." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't ignore what was happening around us. The station's equipment started acting up. Our spectrometers gave inconsistent readings, the cryofreezer alarm went off without reason, and the atmospheric monitors kept resetting to 0. The worst was the temperature. Despite the heaters being cranked to their max, the lab was freezing, and frost started forming on the windows. We checked for leaks, recalibrated everything, but nothing worked. Then came the dreams. It started with Walker. She mentioned one morning that she had a nightmare about a vast, pulsating shadow beneath the ice. The next day, Harris admitted he dreamt the same thing. By the third night, even I couldn't sleep without seeing it. This infinite, breathing darkness that felt like it was pulling me under. I brushed it off as stress. That's what scientists do, right? Rationalize, control the narrative. But Harris was losing it. He outright refused to go near the heart anymore. "You need to destroy it," he hissed at Walker during one of our meetings. "This isn't science, it's something else." "Something else?" she shot back. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I? Look around you. You think it's a coincidence the station's falling apart, that we're all having the same damn dream?" No one answered him, but the room felt heavier after that. One night, I stayed late in the lab, reviewing footage from the containment chamber. The camera we set up had been recording non-stop since the heart was transferred. At first, it was just more of the same. Slow, steady beats, a faint shimmer of condensation on the glass. But as I skipped through the timestamps, something caught my eye. The thudding sound. It wasn't random. I cross-referenced the audio with environmental data from the station. Every time someone entered the room, the heart's beats became stronger, faster. It wasn't just alive. It was reacting to us. I sat back, staring at the screen as the realization sank in. The thing wasn't just pulsing. It was waiting. The breaking point came when Dr. Walker finally decided enough was enough. "We're scientists," she said, her voice strained but resolute. "But we're also human, and we have limits. This thing is beyond them." It was the first time anyone openly acknowledged the dread we'd all been feeling. Even Harris, who had been spiraling into paranoia for days, nodded in grim agreement. For the first time, we all seemed united in a singular purpose: to end this. The plan was straightforward. We'd use the station's high-temperature furnace, normally reserved for incinerating biohazardous waste, to destroy the heart completely. The furnace could reach temperatures upwards of 1500 degrees Celsius, enough to obliterate organic material to ash. Nothing would survive that, not even this monstrosity. The preparation was meticulous. Walker insisted on strict protocol, and for once, no one questioned her. We wore our full protective gear, thermal gloves, lab coats and goggles, despite the bitter cold still permeating the station. The heart was carefully transferred into a reinforced steel container, then wheeled to the furnace room on a trolley. Harris kept his distance, his eyes darting nervously to the chamber's glass windows as if expecting the heart to leap out at him. I focused on the equipment, double-checking the furnace's settings and ensuring the fail-safes were active. It was a model I was familiar with, a robust, industrial-grade incinerator designed for extreme reliability. The digital display glowed faintly in the dim light, and I felt a small, fleeting sense of control. We had this. As the heart was placed into the furnace, I couldn't help but notice how it seemed still. The pulsing had stopped entirely, almost as if it knew what was coming. My rational mind told me it was just coincidence, a mechanical process, nothing more. But a small, irrational part of me wondered if it was holding its breath. Walker closed the furnace door with a finality that echoed in the silent room. She turned to me, nodding once. "Start it." I pressed the button, and the machine roared to life. Flames burst within the chamber, visible through the small observation window. The heart was engulfed in an instant, its dark, unnatural mass consumed by the fire. It felt like I had lifted my head out of water. The oppressive thudding sound vanished. The sudden silence felt deafening. Harris let out a shaky laugh, a sound that teetered between relief and hysteria. "It's over," he muttered. "It's finally over." Even I felt a glimmer of hope. The tension that had gripped the station for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of calm. We stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the furnace's temperature hold steady, ensuring nothing remained but ash. As the flames died down, the furnace's sensors confirmed total incineration. Walker turned to the team with a weary smile. It's done. Let's get some rest. For the first time in days, I believed her. I woke to the sound of something crashing so loudly it felt like the entire station had collapsed. The air was freezing, colder than it had any right to be indoors, and I could see my breath hanging in the dim emergency lighting. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and threw on my coat, ignoring the trembling in my hands. The noise had come from the lab. I ran, slipping slightly on the icy patches forming on the floor. By the time I reached the lab door, I already knew something was terribly wrong. The air felt thicker, heavier, and there was a faint, rhythmic sound coming from inside, a sound I hadn't heard since we destroyed the heart. Thud, thud, thud. The lab was in ruins. The containment chamber, which we'd used to study the heart, was shattered. Thick steel walls bent outwards as if something inside had pushed its way out. Equipment lay strewn across the floor, monitors blinking erratically. In the center of the room, sitting in a pool of what I could only hope wasn't blood, was the heart. It was vibrant now, an unnatural crimson that almost glowed in the dim light. It pulsed steadily, stronger than before, the sound so loud I could feel it reverberating in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. "This isn't possible," I whispered. My mind scrambled for answers. Could it have been a hallucination, a shared delusion? Had we somehow failed to destroy it? But no. There were the ashes, still inside the furnace, undeniable proof of what we'd done. And yet, here it was. The sound of glass shattering behind me made me spin around. Harris stood there, wild-eyed, clutching a piece of broken equipment in one hand. "We should have left it alone," he hissed. "You all had to push, didn't you? You had to know." "Harris, calm down," I said, my voice shaking. "We don't know what's happening. We'll figure it out." "Figure it out?" He laughed, a harsh, grating laugh. "You don't get it. It's not just the heart. It's connected to something. Something alive." I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off, stepping closer, his face inches from mine. "You felt it, haven't you? The dreams, the cold. It's not just in our heads. It's broadcasting. Calling." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The dreams. I knew exactly what he was talking about. The endless void, the sense of something massive shifting just out of sight beneath the ice. I wanted to believe it was stress, my brain playing tricks on me. But the way Harris looked at me, desperate and unhinged, made me wonder if it wasn't something more. "Harris," I said carefully, "you're not making sense. What are you saying?" He pointed a shaking finger at the heart. "That thing isn't just an organ. It's a beacon. It's waking something up." A cold chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the heart, its steady thudding now feeling more like a countdown than a pulse. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously. Harris snapped. He grabbed a metal stool and hurled it across the room, smashing a monitor in a shower of sparks. "We're doomed," he screamed. "We're nothing but ants digging into a mountain. And now it knows we're here." "Stop," I shouted, trying to grab him, but he shoved me away. He picked up another piece of equipment and began smashing it against the lab bench. The noise was deafening, echoing through the room and mixing with the relentless thud of the heart. "Harris, get a grip!" Walker's voice rang out as she burst into the lab, her face pale but resolute. "We need to focus. We can fix this." Harris froze, staring at her like she'd just spoken in another language. Then he dropped the broken equipment, his shoulders sagging. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's already awake." The lights flickered again, and the rhythmic thudding grew louder, almost deafening. This time, it wasn't just the heart. It was coming from beneath our feet. The station had never felt so hostile. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and frost crept up from the walls like a living thing. My breath fogged in the weak emergency lighting as the temperature plummeted far below what our heaters could handle. The lights flickered in and out, casting the lab in a strobe-lit chaos. Every few seconds, the ice beneath us groaned like a wounded animal. And through it all, the heart beat faster, louder, syncing perfectly with the tremors beneath our feet. Dr. Walker's voice cut through the chaos, barking orders. "We're not running. We contain it again, now." "No," Harris shouted, backing toward the door, his eyes wild. "You're insane. It's too late. If we stay, we're dead." I hesitated, caught between them. Walker's confidence was resolute, almost comforting. But Harris looked like he'd already seen the end. His fear was infectious. I wanted to bolt, to run as far as I could, but some part of me couldn't let go. The questions, the impossibility of the heart, it had dug into my mind, and I couldn't leave without understanding. "I'm with Walker," I said, forcing the words through the lump in my throat. Harris shot me a look of pure disbelief before turning and bolting into the hallway. Walker grabbed my arm. "Let's move," she said, pulling me toward the containment chamber. "We seal it. That's the only way." The heart lay in the center of the lab, pulsating like a drumbeat that vibrated through my bones. Walker and I worked quickly, moving in a mechanical rhythm born of pure adrenaline. We pushed the shattered remnants of the containment chamber out of the way and hauled out a secondary unit, a smaller, less robust chamber meant for biological samples. It wasn't ideal, but it was all we had. "Temperature regulation first," Walker said, her voice trembling but steady. I nodded and grabbed the control panel, fumbling with the calibration dials. The unit hummed to life, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe it wasn't too late. But then, the ice screamed. There's no other word for it. A high-pitched, bone-deep sound echoed through the station as the floor beneath us cracked violently. I staggered, nearly losing my grip on the containment panel. Walker cursed and grabbed the edge of the bench for support. The heart's rhythm changed. It wasn't erratic or panicked. It was intentional, calculated. Each beat seemed to match the tremors beneath us, growing louder, faster. I glanced at Walker, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. "We need to hurry," she said, her voice tight. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering unnaturally in the failing light. They moved like smoke, twisting and shifting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. For a moment, I swore one of them looked at me, though it had no eyes, no face, just a void that radiated malice. "We've got it," Walker shouted as we locked the chamber seals. The heart was contained again, its pulsations muffled but still deafening. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then the lab floor heaved violently, throwing us to the ground. The fissure opened without warning. A jagged, gaping maw split the lab in two, swallowing equipment and debris into an impossibly dark void. The containment chamber teetered on the edge, the heart's beats echoing louder and faster like a countdown. And then it fell. Everything went still. The heart sound disappeared, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. I thought it was over. I thought we'd stopped it. But then, the noise began. It wasn't a heartbeat. It wasn't anything I could truly describe. A low, resonant sound rumbled from the depths of the fissure, shaking the walls and vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence. Something enormous, something alive was down there, stirring in the darkness. Walker and I locked eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We both knew. The heart wasn't the thing. It was just a piece of it. The station felt like it was being ripped apart. Every step sent shockwaves through my body as the ice beneath us heaved and groaned. Walker and I scrambled out of the lab, the containment chamber and the heart long gone, swallowed into the abyss. The fissure stretched through the main hallway now, fracturing the floor and walls, as if the station itself was being consumed. We found Harris in the control room, frantically packing a bag with whatever supplies he could grab. His wild eyes locked on mine as he hissed, I told you we never should have touched it." There was no time to argue. Walker grabbed the emergency satellite beacon from the wall while I snagged a handheld radio, though I knew it was useless in the storm outside. We bolted for the airlock, barely managing to pull on our cold-weathered gear before stepping into the howling blizzard. The wind hit like a freight train, stinging every exposed inch of skin and reducing visibility to a few feet. The station was a fading silhouette behind us, its lights flickering like a dying signal. We trudged forward, relying on muscle memory to navigate toward the secondary outpost a few kilometers away. That's when the ground shook again. Different this time. It wasn't the random shuddering of ice under strain. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I risked a glance back, and through the swirling snow, I saw something moving. It was massive, indescribable. The ice itself seemed to ripple and bulge as if something enormous was swimming beneath it, displacing the frozen landscape with each movement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, but Walker yanked me forward. "Keep moving," she shouted over the wind. We stumbled into the outpost hours later, half frozen and barely coherent. Harris collapsed against the wall, muttering incoherently about shadows and whispers. Walker and I managed to activate the backup generator and send a distress signal. Then, we waited. Rescue didn't come for 3 days. By the time the team arrived, the storm had passed, leaving the Arctic wasteland eerily quiet. When we tried to lead them back to the station, we found nothing. The site where it had stood was now a featureless expanse of ice, as though the building itself had been erased. There was no debris, no signs of the fissure, just smooth, undisturbed snow stretching endlessly in every direction. Back at base camp, I filed my report. I included everything: the heart, the containment chamber, the tremors, and the impossible creature beneath the ice. I even uploaded the fragmented video logs from the station, though they were distorted and beyond recognition. The official response came weeks later. My account was dismissed as stress-induced delusions brought on by isolation and environmental conditions. Harris quit the project entirely, retreating to his family in the south. Walker stayed on, but she wouldn't speak to me after the debrief. I could see the guilt in her eyes. She blamed herself, though I knew none of us could have known what we were waking up. As for me, I thought I could move on, but I was wrong. The dream started a month later. At first, they were just fragments, dark shapes beneath the ice, the sound of faint thudding in the distance. Then, they became more vivid. I was back in the lab, staring at the heart as it pulsed stronger and faster, the shadows on the walls growing darker, deeper. The worst part is the sound, that rhythmic thudding. It's with me all the time now. Sometimes I hear it in my apartment, soft but insistent, like it's calling to me. I don't know what we awakened beneath the ice. I don't know if it's still there or if it's already spreading. But I do know one thing. We were never meant to find it. And it's not done yet.